In 1949, a former Fortune magazine writer named Alfred Winslow Jones filed a document with the Securities and Exchange Commission that would create an industry now worth $4 trillion and fundamentally reshape who actually controls American economic policy. Most people think hedge funds are about making money. They are wrong. Money was the byproduct. The real product was immunity. Jones structured his fund as a private partnership. This single decision exempted him from the Investment Company Act of 1940. It freed him from SEC registration requirements. It allowed him to operate in shadows while mutual funds operated under spotlights. The distinction matters. Mutual funds faced disclosure rules, leverage limits, and fee restrictions. Jones faced none of these. He could borrow money to amplify bets. He could short stocks while going long on others. He could charge performance fees that would make traditional money managers blush. By 1968, the SEC counted 140 hedge funds managing roughly $1 billion. The agency published a concerned report about these unregulated pools of capital. Lawmakers read the report. They held hearings. Then they did nothing. This pattern would repeat for the next 7 decades. The inaction was not accidental. It was engineered. From day one, hedge funds existed in a regulatory gray zone created by deliberate legal architecture. Jones did not stumble into a loophole. He built the loophole into the foundation. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. Here's why this matters to you right now. If you have a pension, hedge funds take a cut of your retirement. If you trade stocks through Robinhood or any major retail broker, a hedge fund processes your order and profits from your activity. If you rent a home in a major American city, there's a measurable chance a hedge fund owns your building. If you pay taxes, you subsidize hedge fund managers through a loophole worth $18 billion annually. These are not abstract concerns. These are extractions from your wallet, documented in SEC filings, Federal Reserve reports, and IRS data. The question is not whether hedge funds have power. The question is how they accumulated power so quietly that most Americans do not even know they are governed by it. The hedge fund industry did not grow by accident. It grew by design, and the design centered on one principle: avoid registration at all costs. The Investment Company Act of 1940 created a clear regulatory framework for investment funds: disclosure requirements, leverage restrictions, fee transparency, custody rules. The law made sense after the 1929 crash, exposed how opaque investment pools had devastated ordinary Americans. But the law contained exceptions. Funds with fewer than 100 investors could avoid registration. Funds serving only wealthy individuals could avoid registration. Funds structured as private partnerships could avoid registration. Jones exploited all 3 exceptions simultaneously. His structure became the template. By the 1960s, copycat funds proliferated. George Soros launched his fund in 1969. Michael Steinhardt launched his fund in 1967. Julian Robertson launched Tiger Management in 1980. Each one used the Jones architecture. Each one operated beyond SEC oversight. The growth accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s. By 1990, roughly 600 hedge funds managed $39 billion. By 2000, the count exceeded 3,800 funds managing $490 billion. By 2010, over 9,000 funds controlled $1.9 trillion. By 2023, more than 15,000 funds managed $4 trillion. This growth happened while hedge funds remained largely exempt from the rules governing other investment vehicles. The exemptions created information asymmetry. The public could not see hedge fund holdings in real time. Regulators could not monitor hedge fund leverage. Policymakers could not assess hedge fund risk. This asymmetry became a competitive advantage. Hedge funds could take positions that mutual funds could not. They could use leverage that banks faced restrictions on. They could move faster because they reported slower. The architecture also created political leverage. When you operate in darkness, regulators cannot easily build cases against you. When your investors are wealthy and connected, those investors become advocates against regulation. When your strategies are complex, congressional staffers lack expertise to write effective rules. Form ADV filings with the SEC tell the growth story in raw numbers. In 1990, the database contained minimal hedge fund registrations because most funds fell below reporting thresholds. By 2023, the same database showed over 5,000 registered investment advisors managing hedge fund assets, representing only a fraction of the total industry because many funds still qualified for exemptions. The exemptions survived every financial crisis. They survived the 1987 crash. They survived the 1998 long-term capital management collapse. They survived the 2008 financial crisis. They survived the 2021 GameStop incident. Each crisis produced hearings. Each hearing produced reports. Each report produced modest reforms. And each reform preserved the core exemptions that allowed hedge funds to operate beyond the regulatory perimeter that constrained every other financial institution of comparable size. September 1998 should have changed everything. It changed nothing. Long-term capital management was not an ordinary hedge fund. Its founders included John Merriweather, former vice chairman of Salomon Brothers. Its partners included Myron Scholes and Robert Merton, who shared the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1997 for their work on options pricing. Its investors included central banks, major investment houses, and sovereign wealth funds. LTCM represented the apex of hedge fund credibility, sophisticated strategies, brilliant founders, elite investors, and leverage that reached 25 to 1 at its peak, meaning every dollar of investor capital supported $25 of borrowed money. The fund made money for 4 years. Then, Russia defaulted on its debt in August 1998. Markets moved in ways the Nobel laureates' model said were statistically impossible. LTCM's positions collapsed. By mid-September, the fund had lost $4.6 billion of its $4.7 billion capital base. Here's where the story should have ended, with bankruptcy filing and investor losses. Instead, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York organized a private bailout. 14 major banks and brokerages contributed $3.6 billion to recapitalize LTCM and prevent its collapse. The intervention was not charity, it was necessity. LTCM had accumulated over $1 trillion in derivatives positions. Its prime brokers had exposure throughout the financial system. A disorderly unwinding threatened to trigger cascading failures across Wall Street. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan testified before Congress on October 1, 1998. He explained the systemic risk, he described the intervention, he acknowledged the moral hazard created by preventing a major fund from failing. Congress held hearings. The House Banking Committee heard testimony from regulators, academics, and industry representatives. The Government Accountability Office investigated. The President's Working Group on Financial Markets issued a report. The working group's recommendations were modest: improved risk management at banks, better disclosure of hedge fund strategies to lenders, enhanced regulatory coordination. No direct regulation of hedge funds themselves. The recommendations relied on what regulators called market discipline. Banks would monitor their hedge fund clients. Investors would demand better risk controls. The industry would self-regulate. This approach had a name: indirect regulation through counterparties. It assumed that banks would refuse to lend to overly risky hedge funds. It assumed that investors would flee funds with excessive leverage. It assumed that market forces would constrain behavior more effectively than rules. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong. 10 years later, the same banks that were supposed to monitor hedge fund risk nearly collapsed the global financial system. The same leverage that destroyed LTCM appeared throughout the shadow banking system. The same indirect regulation approach failed to prevent a crisis that cost American households $13 trillion in lost wealth. But in 1998, the hedge fund industry emerged from the LTCM crisis stronger than before. It had demonstrated that it was too connected to fail. It had proven that the government would intervene to prevent disorderly hedge fund collapses. It had established that losses would be socialized while profits remained private. The industry learned the lesson well. By 2000, hedge fund assets had grown to $490 billion. By 2007, they exceeded $2.1 trillion. The near-death experience became a proof of concept. Grow large enough, become connected enough, and the government will protect you. The Managed Funds Association incorporated in 1991. Its founding purpose was explicit: represent the hedge fund industry before Congress, regulators, and the public. This was not subtle. This was organized political power. By 2010, the MFA maintained a full-time lobbying operation in Washington. Open Secrets data shows the association spent between $7 and $10 million annually on federal lobbying from 2010 through 2023. Individual hedge funds supplemented this spending with their own lobbying operations. Citadel, the firm founded by Ken Griffin in 1990, maintained a separate lobbying presence. Renaissance Technologies, the quantitative fund founded by mathematician James Simons, employed lobbyists on specific issues. Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund by assets under management, engaged on regulatory matters affecting its strategies. The lobbying focused on specific issues documented in LD2 disclosure forms filed with the Senate Office of Public Records. Carried interest preservation topped the list. This tax provision allows hedge fund managers to pay 20% capital gains rates on their performance fees instead of 37% ordinary income rates. The managers argue their fees represent returns on investment. Critics argue the fees represent compensation for labor. The tax difference runs to billions of dollars annually. The Tax Policy Center estimated in 2023 that eliminating the carried interest preference would raise $18 billion over 10 years. Every major tax reform proposal since 2007 has included carried interest modification. Every final bill has preserved the preference. The lobbying record explains why. MFA lobbying disclosures specifically cite carried interest as a priority issue in every year since the organization began filing detailed reports. The association coordinated testimony, It provided technical arguments and mobilized member firms to contact congressional offices. SEC reporting requirements represented another lobbying priority. The 2010 Dodd-Frank Act required hedge funds to register with the SEC and file Form PF disclosures about their holdings and leverage. The industry lobbied to minimize disclosure requirements, delay implementation, and preserve confidentiality protections for filed information. The lobbying succeeded on multiple fronts. Form PF data remains confidential. The public cannot access individual fund filings. Even aggregated data releases are limited. The SEC delayed full implementation for years after the law passed. Volcker Rule exemptions consumed substantial lobbying resources. The Volcker Rule, part of Dodd-Frank, prohibited banks from proprietary trading and limited bank investments in hedge funds. The industry lobbied for exemptions, delayed implementation, and ultimately secured significant carve-outs that preserved bank relationships with hedge funds. The revolving door amplified lobbying effectiveness. Open Secrets maintains a database tracking movement between government positions and private sector employment. The pattern in financial services is stark. Former SEC officials join hedge funds as compliance officers, legal counsel, and policy advisors. Former congressional staffers join lobby shops representing hedge fund interests. Former Treasury Department officials join hedge fund advisory boards. This movement creates relationships. A hedge fund hiring a former SEC enforcement attorney gains someone who knows the agency's priorities, personnel, and procedures. A lobby firm hiring a former Senate Banking Committee staffer gains someone with relationships across the legislative calendar. The relationships translate into access. Access translates into influence. Influence translates into policy outcomes that consistently favor industry preferences over competing interests. Federal Election Commission data completes the picture. Hedge fund executives contribute heavily to both political parties. Ken Griffin has given over $100 million to Republican candidates and committees since 2010. George Soros has given comparable amounts to Democratic candidates and causes. This bipartisan giving is strategic. Regardless of which party controls Congress or the White House, hedge fund interests maintain relationships with decision makers. The industry does not bet on electoral outcomes. It hedges. The combined effect of lobbying expenditures, revolving door relationships, and campaign contributions creates what academics call regulatory capture. The regulated industry shapes its own regulation. The watchdog's answer to the watched. In February 2021, Ken Griffin sat before the House Financial Services Committee and denied that Citadel Securities had influenced Robinhood's decision to restrict trading in GameStop stock. The denial created headlines. The underlying business model created far larger consequences. Citadel Securities is not a hedge fund. It is a market maker affiliated with Griffin's hedge fund empire. The company pays retail brokers for the right to execute their customers' orders. This practice is called payment for order flow. The numbers are documented in SEC filings. In 2020, Citadel Securities paid approximately $2.6 billion to retail brokers including Robinhood, TD Ameritrade, Charles Schwab, and E-Trade. In exchange, Citadel Securities processed roughly 40% of all U.S. retail equity order flow. 40%, one firm, processing nearly half of all stock trades placed by individual American investors. This concentration echoes documented 19th century market structure abuses. Before the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, stock exchange specialists held monopoly positions in individual stocks. They could see incoming orders before executing them. They could trade against their own customers. They could manipulate prices with limited accountability. The 1934 Act addressed specialist abuses through registration requirements, conduct rules, and exchange oversight. The reforms worked for decades. Then, technology created new intermediaries operating outside exchange floors. Payment for order flow emerged in the 1980s. Bernie Madoff, later infamous for his Ponzi scheme, pioneered the practice. He paid brokers for order flow and executed trades away from traditional exchanges. The practice grew through the 1990s and 2000s. By 2020, payment for order flow dominated retail trading. The major retail brokers eliminated trading commissions entirely. They made money not from customer fees, but from selling customer orders to market makers like Citadel Securities. The model creates conflicts documented in academic research and SEC enforcement actions. When a broker sells your order to a market maker, the market maker profits by executing at slightly worse prices than you could obtain on an exchange. The difference, measured in fractions of pennies per share, accumulates across billions of trades. Academic estimates suggest retail investors lose $1 to $2 billion annually to this price degradation. The model also creates information asymmetry. Citadel Securities sees enormous order flow in real time. This visibility provides insight into retail investor sentiment, positioning, and behavior. The affiliated hedge fund, Citadel Advisors, operates with awareness that includes this market intelligence. Griffin's congressional testimony addressed this relationship. He denied that Citadel Advisors receives trading information from Citadel Securities. He described information barriers separating the two entities. Critics noted that the same individual owns both companies and questioned the effectiveness of internal walls. The GameStop incident exposed the model's fragility. When retail investors coordinated purchases of GameStop stock in January 2021, the rapid price increase created clearing and settlement obligations that overwhelmed Robinhood's capital reserves. Robinhood restricted trading in GameStop and other volatile stocks. Retail investors alleged market manipulation favoring hedge funds that held short positions. Congressional hearings followed. The SEC issued a report. The Justice Department opened an investigation. 2 years later, no major reforms had passed. Payment for order flow continued. Citadel Securities maintained its market share. The concentration of retail order flow in a single firm affiliated with a major hedge fund remained intact. The structure represents a bottleneck. One firm controlling 40% of retail equity execution wields power over how ordinary Americans access stock markets. The firm's affiliated hedge fund operates with structural advantages unavailable to retail investors. This is not a free market. This is controlled infrastructure that extracts value from every retail trade while providing services that appear free. Your retirement savings flow to hedge funds whether you choose them or not. Prekin, the alternative investments data provider, tracked public pension fund allocations as of 2023. The total exceeded $500 billion invested in hedge funds by state and local government retirement systems. This means teachers in California, firefighters in Texas, and government employees in New York have their retirement security tied to hedge fund performance. It means public servants' pensions pay hedge fund fees regardless of whether those funds beat simple index investments. The fee structure matters. Hedge funds traditionally charge 2 and 20, 2% of assets annually as a management fee, 20% of any profits as a performance fee. On $500 billion in pension assets, the 2% management fee alone equals $10 billion annually extracted from public employee retirement funds. Academic research questions whether these fees deliver value. Studies published in the Journal of Finance and reviewed by Federal Reserve economists show that hedge fund performance, net of fees, often trails simple stock index funds. Pension beneficiaries pay premium prices for inconsistent results. Why do pension funds invest in hedge funds despite the evidence? The answer involves documented relationships between hedge fund marketers and pension decision makers. Consulting firms that advise pension boards often receive fees from hedge funds they recommend. Board members sometimes receive speaking fees, charitable donations to favored causes, or post-government employment from firms they oversee. SEC enforcement actions have documented pension fund corruption. Pay-to-play schemes in New York, California, and other states resulted in criminal convictions and civil settlements. The underlying pattern persists. Hedge funds, potos, cultivate pension board relationships to secure allocations worth billions in fee revenue. The pension integration creates political consequences. When state legislators consider hedge fund regulation, pension officials warn that restrictions might harm retirement system performance. The warning is often unfounded given net of fee performance data. But legislators hesitate to risk blame for pension shortfalls. Hedge funds have also expanded into housing in ways that affect your rent or home purchase options. Following the 2008 financial crisis, hedge funds and private equity firms bought foreclosed homes at steep discounts. Blackstone Group created Invitation Homes, which became the largest single-family rental landlord in America. American Homes 4, Rent, backed by private equity, became the second largest. SEC filings document the scale. Invitation Homes owns over 80,000 single-family homes across major metropolitan areas. American Homes 4, Rent owns approximately 60,000 homes. Combined with smaller institutional landlords, hedge fund and private equity-backed companies own over 700,000 single-family rental units. This ownership affects housing markets in documented ways. Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta research published in 2023 examined institutional landlord effects on rents. The study found that neighborhoods with high institutional ownership experienced 15 to 20% higher rent increases compared to similar neighborhoods with traditional landlords. The institutional owners, with access to sophisticated pricing algorithms and centralized management, extracted higher rents than individual landlords. The ownership also affects home purchase availability. Every home owned by an institutional landlord is a home unavailable for first-time buyers. In competitive markets like Phoenix, Atlanta, and Charlotte, institutional buyers competed directly with families seeking home ownership. The institutions paid cash and closed fast. Families with mortgages lost bidding wars. The housing integration creates another constituency opposing hedge fund regulation. Pension funds that invest in Blackstone benefit when Invitation Homes raises rents. The same retired teacher whose pension depends on hedge fund returns may struggle to help grandchildren afford housing in markets those hedge funds dominate. These are not separate phenomena. They are connected extractions. Hedge funds take fees from your pension. They raise your rent or price you out of home purchases. They process your stock trades at prices that favor their profits. The connections span your financial life from retirement savings to housing to investment accounts. In March 2020, the U.S. Treasury market broke. This should be impossible. Treasury securities are the foundation of global finance. They are the risk-free asset against which all other investments are measured. They are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Yet for several days in March 2020, Treasury prices behaved erratically. Bid-ask spreads widened dramatically. Liquidity vanished from the world's deepest market. The Federal Reserve intervened with over $1.5 trillion in emergency purchases to stabilize conditions. Federal Reserve research subsequently documented what went wrong. Hedge funds had accumulated enormous basis trade positions. These trades exploit tiny price differences between Treasury securities and Treasury futures contracts. The price differences are small, often fractions of a basis point. Hedge funds use massive leverage to amplify returns from these small discrepancies. The leverage ratios were extreme, Bank for International Settlements. Researchers documented hedge funds using 50-to-1 leverage on basis trades. For every dollar of investor capital, the funds borrowed $49 to increase position size. When COVID-19 triggered market panic, asset prices moved in unexpected ways. The basis trades lost money. Margin calls forced hedge funds to sell Treasury positions to meet collateral demands. The selling created more price pressure. The price pressure triggered more margin calls. The feedback loop threatened to collapse the market. The Federal Reserve's intervention socialized the risk. The central bank absorbed selling pressure that hedge funds could not manage. American taxpayers implicitly backstopped losses from leveraged bets made by funds serving wealthy investors. The basis trade did not disappear after March 2020. It grew. BIS research published in 2023 documented hedge fund treasury positions exceeding $800 billion. The leverage ratios remained high. The systemic risk remained concentrated. The same trade that required a $1.5 trillion intervention in 2020 expanded to even larger scale. Federal Reserve officials have expressed concern in documented speeches and testimonies. SEC Chair Gary Gensler warned in 2023 about hedge fund leverage in Treasury markets. The Financial Stability Oversight Council, created after the 2008 crisis to monitor systemic risks, has examined hedge fund activities repeatedly. Yet regulation remains limited. The pattern repeats from LTCM through 2008 through 2020. Hedge funds accumulate leverage. The leverage creates systemic risk. Crises force government intervention. After the crisis passes, the industry resumes the same strategies at even larger scale. The industry has demonstrated it can grow faster than regulators can respond. From 140 funds in 1968 to 15,000 funds in 2023. From $1 billion to $4 trillion. From a regulatory footnote to a systemically important presence in every major financial market. The architecture Alfred Winslow Jones created in 1949 has evolved into something he could not have imagined. The private partnership structure that allowed one former journalist to avoid SEC registration now shields an industry larger than the GDP of most countries. The immunity Jones built into his fund's DNA has proven resilient across 7 decades of financial crises, regulatory initiatives, and political transitions. The hedge fund industry has faced investigations, enforcement actions, congressional hearings, and academic criticism. It has emerged from each challenge larger and more entrenched than before. The wealth extraction continues, from your pension through fees that often exceed performance, from your brokerage account through payment for order flow, from your housing costs through institutional landlord rent optimization, from your tax bill through carried interest preferences and crisis bailouts. You did not choose to participate in this system. The system enrolled you automatically through pension allocations you did not control, brokerage arrangements you did not understand, and housing markets you could not avoid. The 15,000 hedge funds managing $4 trillion are not merely investment vehicles, they are infrastructure. They are embedded in your retirement, your trading, your housing, and your government's bond market. They have captured not just Washington, but the financial machinery that shapes your economic life. Understanding the system is the first step toward recognizing how power actually flows in American finance. The official story places regulators in charge of markets and elected officials in charge of policy. The documented record shows an industry that has consistently shaped its own regulation while avoiding accountability for the systemic risks it creates. The hedge fund capture of American economic policy did not happen through conspiracy. It happened through architecture, lobbying, and patient accumulation of structural advantages over 75 years. The Fortune magazine writer who filed that 1949 SEC document could not have planned what followed. But the industry that grew from his innovation has demonstrated remarkable consistency in protecting its privileges while expanding its reach. The money trail leads from your wallet to their fees. The power trail leads from their lobbying to your laws. The history they never taught you in school is documented in SEC filings, congressional testimony, Federal Reserve research, and academic publications. Now you know where to look.